Hello there and welcome back to the Photography Made Simple podcast with me, your host, Audrey-Ann. Now this week we are talking about child photography, very specifically how to capture joyful images of children. Because for me, this can be the nirvana of child photography, getting images where the child looks happy, full of joy and completely carefree. And that's because to me, that's what childhood is kind of all about. It's that time in your life when you are completely carefree and the slightest things can bring you immeasurable joy. So I love to capture that in photos. So in this week's episode, I've got 5 tips for you that will help you capture the joy of children. And these are going to work for you whether you're capturing your own family or if you're in business and you are photographing other people's children in a client session. Doesn't really matter. All the tips are going to work regardless of whether it's your own kids or someone else's. Now, before we do dive in, I do want to let you know about a little freebie that I have for you. I always try and include a little freebie. This one is some child poses and prompts. So if you would like some free child poses and prompts, do make sure that you go to the show notes for this episode at livesnaplove.com/16 and you will find a link to go and download them there. So that's livesnaplove.com/16. Hey there, I'm Audrey-Ann, founder of Live Snap Love, and I'm on a mission to help photographers just like you grow their photography skills quickly and in a way that feels simple and easy so you can shorten the learning curve and get photos you love faster. I created this Photography Made Simple podcast to share simple, actionable techniques, helpful insights, and practical advice on all things photography. So if you're itching to take your photos to the next level, whatever that level may be, you're in the perfect place. So let's get started. Okay, so let's go ahead now and dive into my 5 tips for capturing joy in children. So the first tip I have for you is to create fun moments. Yes, for capturing fun, joyful images of your children, you're going to have to make sure that they're doing something that they actually enjoy. I know that many times we try and get our child to do something because we think it looks good, or rather than something that the child would actually enjoy doing. So I want you to think about your session. And again, I mean a session in terms of whether you're photographing your own child or someone else's children. So think about your session not as simply a way to get joyful expressions, but what would be truly incredibly fun for the child. What do they love to do? What makes them laugh the most? What are their interests? What really sparks joy in your child? So if you're photographing your own children, you've got a great start here because you know your child better than anyone. If you're photographing someone else's kids, then ask. You can always just do that in a quick call before the session, find out what they like to do. And many people do questionnaires where they find out more about the child, what their likes are, their dislikes, their hobbies, and therefore you can start to plan something that incorporates what the child loves to do. Now, for most children, it's things like moving around. No child really likes being stuck and, confined into an area. So we really want to find something that a child likes to do. So for me, my son's favorite was jumping on the bed. That was one where I got lots of fantastic shots of him being really happy, jumping about on the bed. Running about anywhere, is really active, jumping. So for me, it was mainly about making sure that I kept him active and making sure that when he did that activity, just like running about, that I controlled it. So if he was running about, I didn't let him run about willy-nilly. I would say, play the traffic light game where you tell the child to go when you yell green, stop when you yell red. So you can have more with Amber and so on for older children, but simply that way of making sure that I could get him to run when I wanted him to run, stop when I wanted him to stop, but I would still get that joyful expressions. Or I might instruct him to go and jump off a rock. And again, I'm making sure that I'm in the perfect position to get the best light, the best composition, but he's having so much fun and I get that joyful images. Other examples could be just, running along the beach and jumping into the water. They could love playing on the swings. For smaller children, it could be being thrown in the air. For others, it could be playing with kites. It doesn't really matter what that activity is, as long as you have an activity that the child really enjoys doing and that is going to look good in your photos. Now, when you have a fun activity in mind, then make sure that you decide on a suitable location as well. So here's just a couple of things to bear in mind when you're considering this. Make sure that wherever you choose has plenty of space for the child to do the activity and for you to capture it. For example, as I said, my son used to love a bit of jumping on the bed. Doing it in the child's room where there was a single bed wasn't so great. So we always went into the main bedroom where we've got a large king bed. The light was so much better there. So it was much more natural place to take those photos to have him jump on that main bed. Also, when you're shooting indoors, do make sure that you choose a location that has great natural light coming in. So if you're shooting indoors, you're looking at the light and also making sure that there's enough space for whatever activity you have chosen to do. If you're shooting outdoors, make sure you are in a location where the children are free to run around and there's no real safety hazards there. Believe me, there's not much fun in having to make sure that you keep a 3-year-old away from the water, doesn't fall into a lake or goes near a busy main road. And that tends to lead to tears more than joy because you're stopping them from doing something. So make sure that wherever you go, there's enough space for them to run around in without you having to, watch them like a hawk and keep pulling them away from something that might try and grab their attention. Okay, let's move on now to tip number 2, and that is don't be afraid to use props. Now, I know that many people think of elaborate styled photo shoots when they think of props, but props don't have to take over the image. It can be something really simple, and it can just be there to get happy faces from your children rather than take over the image. So this, for me, can be things like balloons. Bubbles is another one. I tell you, if you're a child photographer or even for your own children, one of those bubble machines, one of the best investments you can make. I have so many happy images of my child running around chasing balloons. Best investment ever. It can also be things like large candy lollipops, kites, paints, dress-up clothes. For younger children, it might just be a colourful blanket. For playing peekaboo, if they've just got a new puppy, it could be that. Anything that you can have in the image that you don't mind being in there and that your child is going to find fun. So again, those examples I gave you were classic ones that pretty much all children love, but you might have something very specific to your child. Maybe they're really into aeroplanes. Then adding one into the scene or giving them one that they can play with might give you that guaranteed joyful expression for that particular child that might not spark the same joy in another one. But when using props, just make sure you're happy for whatever you use to be in the frame. So for example, again, another thing my son loved doing was playing with trains. This was less joyful, but he enjoyed that. If I wanted photographs, I often did it with the really nice classic looking wooden set rather than, a latest plastic singing version. And that way I got that expressions and I captured things I loved, but I had things in the frame that I didn't mind being in there. So make sure that it's something that the child actually enjoys, rather than something that will just look good in the photo, but equally make sure you're happy for it to be in the photo. You don't want to give something and then take it away because you don't want it in the image. Okay, let's move on now to tip number 3 for capturing joy. So at the moment, you have all the things that you need to spark joy. You have something that the child likes to do, or you've given them a prop that sparks joy and they love to play with, and you're doing this in a location where you're not going to have to kind of hem them in or worry about safety or try and move them to a different location because you didn't think about the light, and you've got that location and you've given something for the child to be joyful and excited about. So really what's left now is our abilities as a photographer. And that brings me on to tip number 3, which is to make sure you're using a fast enough shutter speed. Because where there is joy, happiness, and laughter, there is usually a lot of movement. So shutter speed is going to be a really important factor in making sure that you get a sharp image. Now, there is a rule that you may have heard about never moving below 1/125 when photographing a person. But if you're photographing an active child, you need to go way higher than that. So for a moving child, I would say at least 1/800. You might get away with slightly less than that, but if in doubt, go higher, because really they can move fast depending on what they're doing. So the faster the activity, the more unpredictable the activity, then go higher with that shutter speed. Let's move on now to tip number 4, which is to isolate the emotion. So this is if you really want to make the joyful expression on your child the main focus of the image. It can help to make sure that it's the only strong element in the frame. In other words, removing anything else from the scene that could distract from the expression. Now, a really simple way to do this is just to get in closer. So having your subject close and center in the frame will just help isolate them because there's nothing else there to detract. And that way the emotion, that joy, can take center stage. Another trick for this is to use that longer length lens. That helps pull the background closer, and that means you simply get less of it in the frame. Again, this can help make sure that you get all the attention on your subject. If you are in a cluttered location and you can't really, deal with that, you can't move your subject, then blurring out the background is another great way to help bring focus and attention to your subject. And you can do this by using a wider aperture, that's a smaller f number, and just making sure that your subject isn't too close to that background. Now, one word of caution here though, moving subjects and a shallow depth of field can lead to lots of out of focus images where you don't get what you wanted tack sharp. So be sure that you're really confident in your focusing abilities before you try shooting with a really wide aperture. Personally, I would recommend shooting with a slightly smaller aperture, and that will help make sure that you get more of your images in focus, especially when combined with that higher shutter speed. And tip number 5 is to make sure that there is sparkle in the eyes. So one of the things that can really help give life and joy to your image is to make sure that the eyes have a sparkle. Now this is called catch lights, simply because that sparkle is caused where the light catches the eyes. If you are shooting indoors, make sure you position your subject closer to the window so that their eyes pick up the light. Make sure that they are in some way facing the light. You generally don't want the light coming from behind unless you've got something to bounce the light back. So if you are indoors, a really simple way to do this is just to make sure that whatever activity they do, you have them facing toward the light, or you have the light coming from the side. So if I can use my example of when I used to photograph my son jumping on the bed, I would always make sure we did that in the main bedroom because it had more space. But also there was a window actually to the side of the bed and one behind me, the photographer, facing onto the bed. So that meant from where I was shooting from, I had some light, main light coming from the side, also a little bit of light coming from the front. And that meant that my child was in a perfect position to get those catch lights and have eyes that were full of light. So if you are setting up an activity indoor that is fun, make sure you pay attention to where the light is coming from and try and set up the activity or use a location where you have the light either coming from the front or the side. Now, if you are outdoors, this can be a little bit more tricky, but generally, again, this is more about making sure that you are in the position where you know that the child is going to get good light. And again, let me use my example of having a child jumping off a rock. Make sure you are in the position where you are capturing light in the eyes. Now, if you are doing something like jumping off a rock, you're probably going to be getting full body. Obviously, having catch lights in the eyes is not so important then. But if you are photographing your child, say, chasing after bubbles, you get yourself into position where you know the light will be good, and then you simply have to wait for your child to come into that position. It can be a little bit more tricky photographing outdoors when you are have active children. And that is again why I like to do things like the traffic light game. I make sure that I have them running between two locations, for example, and I'm primed and poised, ready for when they run into that second location or just before they start running. Their faces are usually giddy with excitement and they're happy, but I know that I'm getting that perfect expression and I'm getting good light on my subject. So a lot of it when you're capturing joy is about making sure that where you set up the activity is good and that you and the photographer is in the right position. And if you can, guide the activity so it's coming into the perfect position for you to take photographs from. Okay, don't forget as well that we have that free child poses and prompts list. You can go and grab that right now over at the show notes for this episode. You'll find them at livesnaplove.com/16 and I'll link to the download there. And I'll link to some other resources that I might think you might find useful and interesting as well. So that's livesnaplove.com/16. So let's really quickly recap those 5 tips. So the first tip was to make sure that you're creating fun moments for the child. Do something that your child really loves to do. If you're photographing someone else's children, ask them, what do they find joyful? If in doubt, things like running, jumping, bubble machines, kites, they're all fairly classic child activities. Take a few things along with you that you can use, like a bubble machine or a kite if it's someone else's, and most children love those. Remember, and you can try and tailor this to the age group as well. Secondly, don't be afraid to use props. They can definitely add interest to an image anyway. Plus, you can get more joyful expressions from the child. So balloons, again, most young children love balloons and they can look fantastic in your image. The next considerations are your practical ones. Make sure you're using a fast enough shutter speed or you'll risk getting motion blur. And you want to make sure that you don't have too many things competing for attention in the frame. So watch that aperture that you're using as well and watch the backgrounds and so on. Make sure you get yourself into a position where you have a good background. And if there's a bit of clutter there, make sure you blur out the background a little bit. And make sure also that you're in a good position for the light. Remember, tip number 5 was to make sure that there's sparkle in the eyes. So make sure that wherever you're setting up, you are going to be able to get light into the eyes as well. Again, you don't have to worry about this so much when you are doing full body shots, but certainly when you're getting in close, you want to make sure that you can see that sparkle in their eyes. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and you got some tips that will help you capture joyful images of your children. Don't forget to download that free child poses and prompts list at livesnaplove.com/16. And I will see you again, same time, same place next week. Bye for now. So that wraps up this week's episode of Photography Made Simple. I'll be back at the same time, same place next week. But if you want more, head on over to livesnaplove.com/podcast, where you can find all the resources and the downloads mentioned, plus a whole lot more. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you won't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week.